No, I'm a megalomaniac and an egomaniac, and I've always expected utter global domination to arrive at my feet. So the only thing that puzzled me was that it took so long to come true. My kind of ideal experience for the reader, if you like, is to laugh all the way through the story, and then at the end go, "What in the name of hell were we laughing at there?" You know, that's what I want the reader to feel. My first book of stories came out in Ireland in 2007 with a small independent press in Dublin called The Stinging Fly. I've just recently published a book of stories in Ireland and in the UK called Dark Lies the Island. And my first novel came out in Europe last year, City of Bohan, and it's Bohan, not Bohane, in case anybody gets that wrong. We're given to feuds in Irish history. Feuds are nothing new. So for sure you could trace all the grievances in Bohan back to older grievances as well. But I also wanted it to exist as its own world and its own place without necessarily having these strings pulling it out there. But I think any book that's worth its salt you can read in different ways with references to the world that's there, our own world, and other tangents that might come away from that. Ireland is a very small island, a wet, tormented little rock on the edge of the Black Atlantic. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots of Irish writers. And you throw a stick in Ireland and you hit a poet over the head, or a playwright, or somebody. So when you're emerging as a writer in Ireland, you can sometimes feel, oh God, it's all been done, you know? It's all been done to death. But the more you look around, you find actually that there are whole swathes of Irish society that have never been committed to paper. For example, the working class speech of cities like Limerick and Cork and Galway have very, very rarely appeared between book covers. And it's not for any particularly sinister reason, it's just that those communities weren't in the way of producing books. You know, so there's actually a whole really interesting sort of stream of Irish talk that's never been done, that's never been caught, I think. So the conversation of the city of Bohan would be very recognisable to anybody who knows the talk of Cork City or Limerick City, and the way the young and those who fancy themselves as cool would talk in those cities. And the city of Bohan is lots of things, but what it is ultimately, it's a projection of what homicidal teenage hipsters might sound like in such an Irish city in the middle of the century. And as such, it was great fun to write. And it's a belated discovery you make as a writer that you should be having fun. You should be having a good time. It shouldn't be like the biopic version of a writer's life where you're and battering your head off the wall and crunching up the page and throwing it to the bin, you know. You should be laughing and you should be having a howl. You should be having a really good time in there. Because if you're not having a good time, the chances are the reader's not going to have a good time down the line. And I had a great time writing City of Bohan, to the point that I'd probably be tempted to head for that dark, malevolent city again at some point. Most stories will go wrong on you at some point, you know. I always think it feels a little bit like a tightrope walk, a short story, and every sentence is a step along the line, and you can fall off and break your neck at any minute and you'll never get the story back. They're especially difficult for some reason because it's such a concentrated space you're trying to get your information and your story into, and even one kind of off sentence can throw it all out of kilter, I think. So it's when I'm writing a story, I'm thinking of the reader when they're reading a story, and I want the reader to almost feel like there's no air in the room, and to feel like that they have to sit up a little straighter in the chair, turn the radio down, because they're really in this world. It should be a very intense experience to read a short story, and I think a very slow experience. So I want to put that intensity into the writing as well, to make sure that I get that at the far end, if you like, of the process. I think in an odd way, at the moment, it's a good time to be writing short stories and books of stories, because the internet has melted all of our brains, and we have been reduced to the attention spans of little frogs. now. And I know that a lot of people are struggling with novels. Friends of mine who I would have had discussions all the time with about novels aren't reading novels so much, and it's because we're constantly online now, and we're there all the time in that online space. And when you are there, it creates a kind of congenital impatience. I think you flit. You're on Twitter, you're on Facebook, you're on your email and back again, you're doing this. And you're flitting all the time. And it's very difficult then to go into that quieter, immersive world where you're in a novel, and people are struggling with it, but they still want to read books. So in a kind of weird, kind of sad way, I think there is a moment for the short story. And it could be a really interesting form over the next while. One thing that really, really bothers me and annoys me about short story writers is that very often you'll see in a writer's career, they emerge with a book of stories, and then they just go on to publish novel after novel after novel. And I think, no, keep going at the stories, because it's a really difficult craft, and it's a lifelong craft. And I think it's no surprise that the greatest short stories out there, people like William Trevor, people like Alice Munro, are the people who keep going at stories and who keep writing stories all the way through their career. And it's kind of my first love, the short story as a form, and I'm very devoted to it. And I'll always do both. I will do novels, but I'll always go back to the story as well. And when I have an idea, if I'm lucky enough to have a notion someday, always my first impulse is not to try and expand it out to something longer, but to see if I can reduce it down and get it into the space of a short story. I think most stories can be told quickly. I hate the term literary fiction. It summons up something serious, and so I really admire the work that's been done in the areas that people persist in calling the genres. I love crime fiction, science fiction, fantasy. It's great stuff out there, and it's nice to pull different elements from everywhere and mash them all up and see what you can make. And I think it's important that writers, novelists, try new things all the time. If the Irish writer Julian Gough, recently I was talking to him, he said if a novel is not being novel, it's not a novel. You have to try new stuff all the time. Because I think the novel is 300 years old, and it's very weary, and it's very tired. And, not a great deal new has been done in the novel form in the last while. So I think it really behoves writers to try new things and try bring new influences in from everywhere and see what you can do with it, And it is a wonderfully open form to new things if you just try them. And I mean, it's very important for me as a writer to take risks and not to just find a formula that works for my books and keep going with that, but to chance things and take risks. And sometimes that the story is going to fall out of your hands and smash on the floor, but try it and see what happens. And in that way, it keeps it interesting for me as well. I don't want to get bored. There's an odd thing you discover when you've been writing fiction all the time for a while, and I've been at it quite a while now, and it becomes less the thing you do and more the thing you are. And it sounds vaguely disgusting, but it becomes like a bodily function. When you get up you don't feel good about yourself if you don't do it. So I go to the desk 7 days a week, and I'm there for 3 or 4 more hours every morning. In the average week, there's only 1 or 2 days where it'll seem like it's going well, where there's a sense of flow. But you realize that you have to be there for the slow days where you're slamming your head off the wall to make the good ones, because so much of writing burbles in the subconscious. It comes from the back of the mind. So you kind of make this pact with yourself that you're going to be there and you're going to be available if it sends you anything, if it sends you stories and ideas. I enjoy reading the work a lot. I'm kind of a frustrated actor, and it's actually a really important part of my craft in writing as well. I will read the stuff out aloud, and I will act it out all the time, because I always think that the ear will pick up the false notes in your work quicker than the eye will. It's a really useful tool for the writer. So it might look and sound a bit crazed to a casual observer as I pace up and down the room, screaming and roaring and doing all the voices, but it works for me to operate in that way. Bohan bills sausages and Bohan bills beer. We exist in the high 50s of latitude after all. The winters are fierce, and we need the inner fire that comes from a meat diet and voluminous drinking. The plants worked all angles of the clock, and after the night shift it was the custom to make for S-Town and a brief revel. In the dawn haze, the brewery lads were dreamy-eyed from hops fume, while the slaughterhouse boys had been all the silver and shade of night, up to their oxters in the corpses of beasts, filling the wagons for the butcher's slabs at the arcade market in the Trace. And the wagons rolled out now across the greasy cobbles, and it was a gory cargo they hauled. See the peeled heads of sheep, the veined fleshy haunches of pigs, the glistening trays of livers and spleens, skirts and kidneys, lungs and tongues, carnivorous to a fault. We'd ate the whole lot for you out in Bohan. I think for Irish writers in the 20th century, it was, you had to, do you go with the Joycey in school and put everything in, or do you go with the Beckett approach and take everything back out, or do you go with the Flann O'Brien approach, which is to kind of skew it all and take a more satirical slant? And I'm a bit of a Flann man of the three greats when it comes down to it, and I love that satirical, skewed, demented tradition in Irish literature that goes back to Flann and back beyond to Lawrence Sterne and to Jonathan Swift, and I love that kind of dangerous, playful, nasty stream and streak in Irish writing. And if I wanted to belong to any strand of it, it will be there. But I'm not nationalistic about my work. I'm just going in there and making my worlds. And of course, Ireland is in every sentence and phrase I write. But it's not on a conscious level, really. And it's important that you don't try and just up it and play it up in any way.
I was born in the Bronx. I wanted to be a writer since I was about 8. I remember that we had a creative writing exercise in class, and I wrote something about a baked potato. And they asked me, I was sort of a chubby, 8-year-old, so then they asked me to read it out loud in front of the class, which was mortifying. But then I realized this is actually pretty good, and I enjoyed that, and I will never forget that. Yeah. Walking people is the literal translation of the Irish word for traveler. And the more I thought about my book and my story, personally, I thought about the Irish people beyond travelers and how they're all really travelers, whether it's a capital T or a lowercase. They were people we always saw when we went there to visit, and they'd be in groups by the side of the road. In the beginning, when we were young, they'd still have caravans. They still tented, they lived very much outside. I would ask my parents, what is this? Are they homeless? Being from New York, I knew what a homeless person was, but it didn't quite make sense to me. And they did not explain this sufficiently. They were just travelers. So I'd say, what does that mean? Where do they live? Why don't they want to live in a house, live inside? And my parents, they just didn't really explain it. And so I kept trying to answer that question, again, for a really long time. And they're really an interesting people. I mean, the difference between the travelers, capital T, and travelers like my parents is that the travelers, capital T, they want to be moving. They want to be always in a different place, as far as I understand. They want to be of the earth and of the world and live in a certain way. People like my father or other people who had to leave, they didn't want to leave, and they had to. So there's a difference between coming to New York as a person, as an Irish in 2007 who wants to come and live in Manhattan and, earn a little money and spend a little money. There's a big difference between that Irish person and people of my father's generation who came because there was just absolutely no work. There was no way to live in the place that they were. And so they're sort of travelers despite themselves, despite, I think, what they wanted to be. I'm sure if there had been opportunities, well, I'm not sure, but I imagine if there had been more opportunities in Ireland in the 60s and 70s, more people would have stayed. But, they couldn't stay, so they came here and made a life. And now they have children with American accents, and we're writing books about them. So when I go to Galway or Mayo as a kid, and strangers would say to me or to my sisters, "Welcome home," it was very moving, but it also just made me always think about what, home meant. And in New York, as the child of Irish parents, I always felt like I had a foot in both worlds. There, I am for sure 100% American. in every way, especially in the 80s and the early 90s. You know, the clothes I wore, the way I spoke, the things I had. But here, I very much identified as an Irish person, and compared to people in my high school or especially in college, I was very, very Irish, and I didn't realize really what that meant. You know, I feel like I'm constantly defining what that means, and that's sort of where that book came from. My parents came from the west of Ireland around the same time that those characters came, and it's just something I'd been thinking about since I was really young, how you can be a person from New York and feel fully, you know, of a place where every person you'd been related to before that, you know, in your lineage was from somewhere else. So I think of my father and mother as the end, in a way, of a very, very long line of people, especially where my father's from. It's more remote than where my mother's from. And then that decision to one day get up and leave. And it's just something I'd been thinking about, I think, my whole life. And so I really just, you know, being a fiction writer, you have to be a good listener. And I listened all the time. And I was able to use everything I'd pictured throughout my whole life in this book. My father worked as a sandhog for 35 years. And it's an occupation that's always been interesting to me. I pictured my dad going down into the tunnels, and they're very deep. They're, you know, much, much further down than subway tunnels. And that was scary to me as a kid. There'd be occasional PBS specials on being a sandhog, and they were terrifying. And we would watch as a family because my dad would want to see if he knew anyone, and maybe not realizing that the content would be terrifying for, you know, young daughters, but that this is one example of a type of work that is occurring all the time around us that nobody notices really or appreciates. Because my parents came, not unwillingly, but because they had to, I felt like they always tried to create Ireland at home. And so it was as if Ireland in the 1960s was my house in 1988, you know, in 1992. So what that meant to go from a very rural, beautiful place where there was very little to New York City, to becoming a tunnel worker, to having kids, you know, who ends up going to college and grad school and all these things. And so that's that conflict. I feel like that's the book I'd been thinking about my whole life. And then I just wrote it. Writing Fever was different than writing The Walking People in that Fever's about a real person, and I had to keep certain aspects of her life, Mary Mallon's life, intact. And that was like writing with shackles. It was like writing with a weight around my neck, because I couldn't just let the fiction go and wherever it wanted to go. It sort of felt like writing with an outline, which I don't like to do. And so I tried to focus on the years where Mary went off the radar in order to feel as if it's completely mine to do what I want with. But then the times when I had to go back to the actual history, it felt like a different type of writing. You know, there's a bigger burden on it, I suppose. The research part for a fiction writer is very strange. I tried to research and read as much as I could and then almost forget about it at the same time. And that was a big difference between my first novel and my second novel. Well, first, I thought she was a fictional character, like a lot of people do. I saw a documentary, this is probably in 2005 or 2006, and I decided to read Judith Walser-Levitt's book on Typhoid Mary, and she became even more interesting to me because she was so young when she was taken from her employment and put in isolation. She was Irish. She was a cook, which is something, it's a type of work I feel I understand. I think I'm more comfortable writing about a cook in 1906 than, you know, a hedge fund manager in 2012. That kind of dignity in work that I felt from her, you know, reading about her as she was interpreted by other people was something I liked and identified with. As a character, she's both a victim and a villain, and I liked how complicated she was. And everything I read about her was interpreted by other people, how she felt, what she wanted. These were things that were written about her by lawyers and doctors and Department of Health people, and they were all of a different class than she was, a different education level, and they assumed things about her and her point of view that I felt in 2008, I guess, when I started this, my back went up. I didn't know why they would assume those things. And so it started to feel like a responsibility to give her a voice. There was an assumption, I think, that as an Irish person, that she was not capable of understanding the danger she posed to other people, that she couldn't understand the medical advances of the time, that she was stubborn, that she was thick-headed, a lot of characteristics that were associated with Irish people. There were a few things that worked against her that I think now would hopefully be irrelevant. She was single, but she occasionally lived with a man when she was between situations to whom she wasn't married, and that was held against her. And she was female, but she was not only female, but she seemed perfectly happy and strong. She wasn't cowed by men. I think when people talk about her, especially at the time, it was as if, every cook, every laundress, everybody wants to be the lady of the house, but they can't. And Mary, I always got the sense, didn't want to be the lady of the house. She didn't want to be the wife organizing the dinners and taking care of the kids. She wanted to be cooking and earning money and, visiting her man every third or fourth week. And that's that. And I really liked that about her. I mean, I really was reading between the lines to find my character, but that's the impression I got, and that's what made me really like her. Did she know what she was doing, especially when she went back to cook at Sloan Maternity under a false name? I think it's possible that we can, as human beings, know things about ourselves and not know them at the same time. I think she's a good person who was just declining to know inconvenient information about herself. And I think we do this all the time. We just close the door on ugly things that are possibilities. I actually read quite a bit about the years early in the AIDS epidemic and how people dealt with information about themselves. And it was the same, that patient zero, how that must have felt to be presented with this news that people are getting sick and you're responsible. I think any one of us, when we're told that and we feel healthy and good and strong and young, would say, you're nuts. I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing because I love my life. And I really sympathize with that, while at the same time thinking it's terrible to go into a maternity hospital and cook under a false name. But that's what made her so interesting. If she were a straight up villain or a straight up victim, I wouldn't have written the book. I am protective of her. I feel like I know her really well, but this is my fictional Mary. I have no idea if the real Mary would bear any resemblance to the Mary I created. But I think to write fiction and be with something for, at its most bloated form, 400 pages, and then now it's like a trim 350, I think there's no way to do that well if you don't have affection and sympathy for even your most terrible, despicable characters. Being Irish, especially in the United States, is something I feel like we're always reminding each other of. This is the way we do things because we're Irish. I wonder sometimes if there's more reflection on being Irish because we're here than if we were still there. I think Irishness is what's happening at home, in your kitchen, the things you eat, the things you talk about, the things you focus on. I think it's something related to family, and blood and the way you all interact with each other. To be an Irish writer, I identify myself as one, is to set the bar really high, I think. I started reading Irish literature. You start with Ulysses and Beckett, and your mom is reading you Yeats, as a kid, and I think that starts things, and then you start seeking out, Roddy Doyle, and the more contemporary Irish writers, and it goes from there. I mean, I don't only read Irish literature, but I'm an Irish person, that's certain, and I'm a writer, so I'm an Irish writer. Somehow, the more she talked about it, the farther away home seemed to both of them. For Greta, home was not a place that coexisted with America, a place that went on and grew and changed at the same time New York was growing and changing. It felt more like Ireland had ended where America began, as if it were something out of America's past. Even the children had caught on, saying the word home to each other, but meaning Ireland, a place they'd never seen. They don't have pizza at home, do they, Mom? James had asked on his 7th birthday. He held the slice at an angle so that the oil formed a current down the center, leaked onto the plate, and made the thin paper almost transparent. No, love, Greta told him. They have delicious pig's feet.